Good morning. My name is Jovan Kurbalija, and I'm honored and pleased to welcome you to our discussion on legal and governance issues. This discussion is part of our tours of moving around the Geneva by following specific topic and issues, whether in the past we have artificial intelligence, standardization, human rights, environment. This month we have been discussing internally the questions of legal and governance issues in Geneva landscape. And I'm particularly honored and pleased to have today with us highly competent speakers who can help us navigate this landscape. We have with us Roxana Radu, Dr. Roxana Radu, researcher in the field of internet governance, author of the book on internet governance, and person who can give us, let's say, zoom out perspective about Geneva scheme, but also wider landscape of internet governance and digital policy. We have with us Anya Gengo, the senior official of the Internet Governance Secretariat, person behind connecting the regional and national IGFs to the Internet Governance Forum in Geneva. And I'm sure there is no need to introduce Richard Hill, one of the best navigator of the Geneva landscape when it comes to the internet governance, e-commerce, ITU issues, former official of the International Telecommunication Union, but also experienced person in the field of legal issues, digital legal issues, telecommunication, and other topics that we'll cover today. Let me just, before we ask three of them and you attending this to help us navigate the scene, let me just make a few points or few sort of guiding posts for this navigation. What is happening in Geneva is part of the broader discussion, and I'm sure Roxana will reflect more on that. But it is definitely that in Geneva, there is a concentration on the discussion on the governance issues and legal issues. There is obviously terminological confusion. What is internet governance? What is digital governance? What is cyber governance? What is AI governance? And I hope by the end of this tour, we will try to reduce this terminological confusion. But what we have been focusing so far is on governance on any policy issue triggered by the internet. Obviously, it's a huge field with more than 50 issues, triggered by essential use of TCP/IP, transfer communication protocol, internet protocol as basis of the internet. But we won't dig very deep into terminological precision, but it's important to be aware that there are different uses. Ultimately, our aim is to bring this broader discussion to the current moment. I'm sure that you are following developments with Facebook, with the e-commerce, with digital taxation, and other issues. You're also following more specific developments about strengthening of Internet Governance Forum, about the question of Tech Envoy, about the question of the UN approach to digital governance. A lot of it is happening at the ITU, in the World Trade Organization. Therefore, it is going to be quite dynamic and busy autumn. With this outline of a few guiding posts for our navigation, I would like to ask Roxana. Roxana, you have a perspective, broader perspective, but also specific perspective of the Geneva. More specifically, are we realistic when we say that many, if not more than 50% of governance issues are happening in Geneva? And what would be your take on this broader developments and specific and their reflection to specific Geneva scene? Over to you.
Thank you, Jovan. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today. I'd like to start by distinguishing between traditional areas of expertise associated with Geneva and newer or emerging issues in digital governance that are handled, at least partially, out of Geneva. It's a very complex question when it comes to the ecosystem related to digital technologies happening in this part of the world. And it's even more difficult to explain this complexity and their interlinkages if we try to go for the full picture at once. I think by turning to what is traditionally associated with Geneva, we can make sense of where we stand in development of digital technologies. And then we turn to some potential areas that could be further explored for debates here at the local level. So on legal matters, Geneva has traditionally been the home of international humanitarian law. And this has been, this has become a center of reference for the entire world. The work of the International Committee of the Red Cross and the Geneva Conventions have really strengthened the rules and norms that are applicable in times of conflict. And this has recently gained traction also in the cyber discussions. Of course, we are not talking about a constant state of conflict in cyberspace, or at least we try to move away from some of those discussions of the militarization of cyberspace. But it's important to point out that during the pandemics, the protection of healthcare has come up on the agenda as something that should be considered similar to some of the protections we have in times of war for the healthcare sector and in general for critical infrastructure sectors. More recently, this has been reflected in the OEWG process that was chaired by the Swiss ambassador, Mr. Lauber. In the OEWG, which stands for the Open-Ended Working Group on Responsible Behavior in Cyberspace, we have seen discussions around specifically the protection of healthcare and ensuring that not only we generally think of international law as applicable to cyberspace, but that specific international humanitarian law provisions would be applicable in times of pandemics. The OEWG had a consensus report issued earlier this year. And that part of the first iteration of this grouping has ended, but there is another process starting in December. So it's going to be the new OEWG lasting till 2025. And when we look at what's ahead of us in terms of UN processes, with the timeline of 2025, we discovered there are two more in the same pot. So first we have the WISIS plus 20 review that is due around that time. And then we also have a recent process that has started around the ad hoc committee on cybercrime, negotiating a convention on cybercrime. Whereas the WISIS 20 discussions will probably have a much closer link to Geneva, the cybercrime discussions are mostly held in Vienna and New York. But it's important to point out that relevant work around cybercrime is also happening in Geneva. And when it comes to the rules of the road for the cyber discussions and the responsible behavior part of the discussions, a lot is actually going on in Geneva. Some of the UNGG meetings were held here. The UNGG was the UN expert group, or the group of governmental experts on responsible state behavior in cyberspace. Some of those discussions were held here, and there's also an ongoing discussion around responsible behavior as part of the Geneva dialogue with the industry that I know Diplo is spearheading. So there are many different formal processes that have links to Geneva around responsible state behavior, but also more informal ones, like the summit that we've seen between the presidents of Russia and the US in June earlier this year, where key issues for the stability of cyberspace were discussed. If we turn to another traditional area of work associated with Geneva, we see human rights. That's a major focus of so many meetings in Geneva. The Human Rights Council meets 3 times a year, and it has more recently discussed and placed quite important emphasis on privacy, whether it's in the form of resolutions, with privacy applying online the way it applies offline, or in the form of a special rapporteur on these matters. We've seen, and on freedom of expression, we've seen a lot of work happening around human rights. And this is also the merit of the vibrant civil society in town and the easy access to the Geneva negotiations and let's say increased level of transparency in recent years around these issues, which allowed other organizations to get involved as well. Relatedly, the work of the UN Business and Human Rights Group is also interesting, where the focus is mostly on roles and responsibilities of industry. And there is a new process around the responsibilities of investors in digital technologies as well. So this is particularly relevant in the cyber discussions, where the multi-stakeholder participation has been in focus for so many years. Around Geneva, we can talk about the extended Lac Léman region. There has also been, let's say, an effort to bring together startups and create what is called the Trust Valley. So have some of the academic centers linked with spin-offs and with industry in the region, in order to create the equivalent of a Silicon Valley, but probably more oriented towards embedding human rights in the technologies they develop. And thirdly, traditionally, Geneva is known for its trade negotiations and also for its labor negotiations. For the cyber part of things, we see complete silos between these two, and it's actually a pity that there is no conversation between these communities, that we are not seeing the trade negotiators directly speak to the labor concerns and the other way around. The regulation of data flows, or to be more precise, the lack of regulation discussed at the WTO, is also now, let's say, complemented by relevant work done at the UN Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, and other bodies of the UN that have taken on the issue of data flows. When it comes to labor, on the other side of the coin, we're seeing a lot of work around the impact of digital technologies on the labor market, in particular to provide protections for gig economy workers. This area is currently underexplored, and there's, let's say, limited work done on it globally, and it obviously takes a huge effort from a number of stakeholders to bring this forward. But I think the basis of the discussions have been set, and it is likely to happen mostly out of Geneva. And fourthly, I would say Geneva is recognized for the work on standardization for telecommunications. And here I'm sure Richard can speak with more expert insights about some of the work done at the ITU, but also at the ISO, International Standard Organization. And in parallel, we've seen bodies that are not associated with the UN directly that have important contributions to these areas. There's Internet Society based in Geneva that has an institution that is the institutional home of the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force. There's an office of ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, based in Geneva. And there's also a uniform dispute resolution signed with WIPO that ICANN and WIPO jointly run. So there are interesting legal instruments that are based in Geneva, and that could actually be with the participation of stakeholders outside of traditional state bodies, as it happens in the UN. So I think that's a particularity of Geneva. It's not a clear separation of just state actors and then just civil society, or simply industry. I think we're seeing quite a bit of interlinkages and crossovers, and that creates a lot of potential for the future. When it comes to emerging areas, the most exciting part, where could Geneva contribute more and what is currently missing here, we're seeing that the focus on accountability for violations of rules in cyberspace has really been left aside. A lot of the discussions on responsible behavior also plan to tackle impunity, but that work has not really taken off that much. And this is likely to change now with the work of the Cyber Peace Institute that puts forward a framework for accountability and a way to trace commitments of different stakeholders towards maintaining peace in cyberspace. So there is a clear foundation there for this work to to become mainstream. And I think there's a lot of potential also when we look at what the Human Rights Council is doing to have maybe one day discussions about violations of human rights coming from digital technologies discussed in a global fora. Then we have AI discussions. They are extremely fragmented, and some of the institutions in Geneva have also picked up this agenda, and I think it's extremely interesting to see how we move from the ethics of AI discussions to the practical implementation of solutions against the harms of AI and digital technologies. But we're not yet there. We're not yet talking about some of the remedies, some of the tools in place for addressing algorithmic governance failures. Thirdly, I would say there's great potential around health governance and the role of digital technologies in the management of pandemic crisis, if this is going to be here for many more years, but also more generally in personalized health and related areas. There's quite a bit happening already around the WHO, even in terms of discussions of misinformation and disinformation, but there's space for a lot more to be put in place. And I think, again, going back to the setup that we've seen in Geneva with participation from multiple stakeholders and easy access, there's great potential that this becomes a global conversation in which both civil society and industry can be involved. And lastly, I'm going to end on this point. I think we are missing discussions around the environmental costs of digital governance, of digital technologies. And this is an area that could be explored out of Geneva. But again, the discussions seem to be in their early days and quite fragmented. There's obviously some interest in the management of e-waste at the ITU. There's interest in generally reducing our carbon emissions, and these discussions are also reflected in the digital space, but we're yet to say, here is the place where we can actually see this coming together. The IGF is obviously holding a number of sessions around this, and it's really wonderful to see that there is thinking ahead. There's interest in what is happening to the planet, but I think at the moment we are yet to see one arena for these conversations. I think I'm going to end here. Thank you.
Thank you, Roxana, for this quite comprehensive and interesting survey of the landscape. And what resonated while you were describing different actors is that it's becoming really complicated. And as you know, at GIP, we have been trying to reduce complexity, especially for diplomats. And I can see a few of them in the audience. And that would be interesting to hear, particularly from Ambassador Yanis Karklins. Yanis is now in Strasbourg. And to see later on when we start discussion, Yanis, how you may give us just quick reflection, how does Geneva looks from Strasbourg? And what is the dynamics in that, since you spent quite a few years, especially in digital aspects in Geneva. Thank you, Roxana. Please post your comments. Welcome, Nifa. Welcome, other colleagues. Post your comments and questions in the chat. I'll just quickly now, it wasn't initially planned, but let's close one thread with Roxana open about environment and digital. And I will ask Richard, and then you can go into broader reflection, then Anya, to reflect quickly on what you see and what's going on generally in Geneva, Richard, and Anya in the IGF. Richard, over to you.
On the environmental issue.
Yeah, plus the environmental, but then we can go into the broader framing.
Yeah, let's stick to the order. I'll just speak quickly on environmental, then Anya, and then I'll come back. Yeah, I posted some links. The next open consultation of the ITU Council Working Group on Internet is actually on environmental issues. So I did a little bit of research, and although I don't follow that closely, I discovered that the ITU has two lines, really. One is e-waste, and the other one is reducing the electrical power consumption, that is the greenhouse gas emissions. And I posted the links to the chat. People can look at that. And Diplo has a has a whole program on it too. So there is quite a bit going on in Geneva. I don't think, Roxana is of course correct. There's a lot going on elsewhere. It's fragmented, but I don't think that any other international institution is actually doing anything. So maybe the ITU is probably the place where this is starting to happen. And maybe it will pick up momentum. Those who remember the 2012 conference, the World Conference on International Telecommunication Regulations in Dubai, will recall that actually the treaty, which is signed by about 90 countries and not signed by the rest, has an article on reduction of e-waste. So already back then there was an idea, but unfortunately not all the member states agreed that this should be progressed in ITU, but maybe that's changing now. So we'll see how it goes in the future.
Good. Thank you, Richard. We'll come back to the general mapping. I think there is something going on in UNEP as well, but let's go to Anya. Anya, what are you preparing, cooking in the IGF on the environment and digital?
Well, thank you very much. And thank you to Roxana and Richard for excellent remarks. I think, Roxana, yes, you concluded on a very important point for all of us. The harms happening on our environment, in fact, affect all, everyone on the planet individually and obviously collectively. And the IGF community is very much aware of that. And I would say that the awareness is growing, especially speaking back in 2019 when we had the environment, especially the focus on climate change and how it relates to internet governance, digital policy, and use of wise, smart, responsible use of digital technologies for preserving our environmental sustainability. And from that 2019 Berlin IGF, we've seen a growing interest from the community, from different stakeholders in discussing more strategically the issues related to the environmental sustainability. So in last year, in 2020, when the IGF was hosted completely online, the open public call for thematic inputs actually resulted in quite a number of inputs submitted for the IGF having a dedicated thematic track only to environment. And that did indeed happen. I have to say that, and that's really building on Roxana's point, that call for input did not maybe result in terms of the quantity in big number of inputs. But when you look at the quality, when you look at the arguments standing behind every single input and proposal, why this needs to be on the priority on our collective agendas, then you can really see a very passionate argumentation from stakeholders coming from different backgrounds. And in that sense, I refer to a number of member states who submitted inputs, number of international organizations, IGOs, a number of civil society organizations, and especially inputs coming from different parts of the world. One of the strongest calls for that came really from small island developing states. And I think it's reasonable really to also assume very, very vibrantly and illustratively present there. And so toward the end of 2020 IGF, we had the so-called concept of voluntary commitments, where different stakeholders would be called upon on the floor to say what they can change in terms of broadly internet governance issues that they feel as a priority. And one of the probably most interesting commitments was given at that time by the serving president of the Swiss Confederation, who pledged that the Swiss Confederation would continue, first of all, to supporting the Internet Governance Forum, but especially as a government to support the International Geneva and their contribution to ensuring that through digitalization processes, Internet governance processes, digital policy processes, we focus on discussing environment in a multi-stakeholder manner. And that pledge resulted in a completely new intersessional work stream introduced in the IGF called the Policy Network on Environment. So that's what we've been cooking the past couple of months in the IGF. A policy network on environment is basically a group of different stakeholders from different parts of the world coming together to discuss matters which they find as a priority related to environment intersecting with digitalization. So in the past couple of months, you had really high-level experts and leaders from different disciplines discussing the role of environmental data for environmental sustainability, the supply chain mechanism, food and water security, electricity, and the role for overall environment and how digitalization plays an important role there. That process is going to, I think, give us a very interesting findings at the upcoming 16th IGF in Katowice. And in addition to the PNE, Policy Network on Environment, as Roxana said, a number of sessions will be hosted in Katowice at the 16th IGF, focusing on various aspects of environmental sustainability in relation to digitalization, just to understand where the problem is, and especially to understand how can we all individually and collectively contribute to ensure that we are living on a planet that is better for all of us.
Thank you. Thank you, Anya. Now we know what is cooking and when is it going to be served for the international community. That's great to hear. We can close this thread which we just improvised on an environment and hello. I guess, yeah, you can hear me. That we can close this thread on environment and digital. We will be also following closely what's going on in Glasgow. Is digital going to get into already, I would say, rather complex agenda of the COP26? Now we go back to Richard. Richard, you heard from Roxana this overall mapping. Now we have to organize the landscape. What is sort of north, south, east, west, obviously, metaphorically speaking? What is the North Star or guiding point which you usually follow? What should we be aware of the landscape? Please give us your take on the Geneva landscape.
Yes, thank you, Jovan. In the preparation, you said I should comment kind of on what are the current winds, in what direction Geneva should sail when it comes to legal and governance issues in the digital realm. And I like that question because my answer is, well, it's very turbulent times. The winds are blowing in all directions. We haven't seen a hurricane yet, thank God. But we've seen many hurricanes, like Facebook goes away for a day. Some people might think it would have been better if Facebook had gone away permanently, but most people would disagree with that. They really rely on Facebook. So I think what we're seeing now is that there's general consensus that everything is internet. All walks of life are affected by the internet. It's become so important that you can't leave it to the geeks, to the technicians anymore. I was much amused at a meeting, and I won't name the countries, but everybody knows who they are, where people were saying seriously, internet governance has worked fine under the current model, and it's continuing to work fine, and we shouldn't change anything. But these are the very same states who in other forums argue, well, no, wait a minute, we have a big problem with fake news, we have a big problem with abuse of dominant power by the GAFA giants, we have a big problem with taxation, and guess what? In WTO, they're saying, and we need a whole new bunch of e-commerce rules. And when you look at what's actually being proposed, they're just internet governance rules. So there's a lot of schizophrenia going on. Governments, I think, are beginning to understand there's an issue. They don't know how to cope with it. I think that's normal. I don't think it's fair to criticize governments because they go slowly. It does take time to understand the issues and understand the solutions. Rather, what bothers me is that we're seeing a reduction in international cooperation. The world, thanks to the internet, and I think it's a good thing, it started, with, of course, with telegraphy, then telephony, and now the internet has become much more integrated. And on the whole, that's been a very good thing. And in order for that to work, we need international cooperation. That's why the UN was created, and that's why all of these specialized agencies do a lot of work, and it's mostly been extremely positive. But now, unfortunately, we're seeing a reduction, and we're seeing increasing tensions between the US and Europe on things like data and data privacy, between the US and Europe and Russia on a whole bunch of issues, between the US and China on a whole bunch of issues. The latest one is the US has just forbidden China Telecom from offering services in the US. Okay, it's not a big business for China Telecom, but still, and they invoke national security. Well, okay, if we start doing that, then everybody's going to involve national security. And guess what? We're going to go back to the old national telcos because you can only have a national company delivering telco services in the nation. So I think this is at a time when we actually need more international cooperation. It's disheartening to see these tensions, and they go straight down to bread and butter internet issues, as was mentioned in the beginning. You know, how to ensure that we have proper cybersecurity, that hackers aren't allowed to run free, and that we don't have more and more ransomware, which we're getting. And although it's not an internet issue, but I take the pandemic as an illustration of how things are going wrong in terms of international cooperation. The pandemic, by definition, is obviously a global issue. That's what the definition is, a disease that has global effects, and we know it has. So we should have had, of course, a concerted, agreed global effort to combat it. And we have an organization that's supposed to do that, the WTO. And the WTO actually, if you look at the website, actually does publish very good guidance about what to do, what not to do. But what happened? No national government followed the WTO guides. Well, I guess maybe small ones who don't have expertise did, but you know, all the developed countries and the big countries who have their own epidemiological centers did their own thing. And so we have this cacophony of, you know, different countries have different policies in terms of traveling, of testing, etc. And it's amazing, you know, if you want to do an exercise, to start looking at what you have to do in order to travel to different places. In Europe, it's not a problem; it's harmonized, but everywhere else, it's completely different. And so we did not have a global coordinated response. The best example is the vaccines. The vaccine policy is very different in different countries. Availability is different. As we know, the rich countries have vaccinated most of the people who wish to be vaccinated, and the poor countries have not been able to even get vaccines. And then even in countries, we have this cacophony because some people don't want to get vaccinated. Some people think the pandemic is fake, etc. And ICTs, of course, are a big contributor to that. That's why I linked back to the internet, because a lot of people are getting, including some of my wife and my close friends, are getting their misinformation from Facebook or the internet. And so they go, oh, but so-and-so said that it's not dangerous. And I said, well, you know, if you actually look at the data, you'll see it is dangerous. But of course, people don't look at the data. They just take the feed that comes from their social network or whatever, where they're getting their misinformation from. So we have some very real issues here, which would require international cooperation. But I see less and less willingness to have international cooperation and increasing tensions and trying to say, well, you know, the other guys are evil. I'm just going to do my own thing. And you've discussed this many times, Jovan, we risk having blocks, which will be different from the blocks that we had during the Cold War, but will kind of have the same problem in terms of reducing cooperation. So I think very turbulent times. I do think that Geneva could be the place to resolve this. And hopefully, you know, Geneva was always functioning quite well, even during the Cold War, better than New York, because Geneva was focusing on more technical issues where you could find agreement, even if you disagreed at a very high political level. So hopefully we can come back and restore something like that. But right now, I'm not very optimistic.
Thank you, Richard, for highlighting particularly a few points. And we'll ask Yanis shortly to join us and to give his reflection as probably one of the most experienced ambassador who served in Geneva, now in Strasbourg. But what you highlighted in particular is mainstreaming of traditional political issues via internet and digital into the focus, with unfortunately more divisions, more conflicts, more fragmentation. And that's really a worrying sign, and that could lead to further fragmentation, definitely on policy debates, but potentially of the internet. And this is a huge risk. Yanis, are you with us? Could you just give us a few comments from Strasbourg? Let's see if Yanis, if he can hear us or if we can hear him. And in the meantime, Carlos, great reflections on the digital citizen. Carlos is from the canton here, but also from Colombia, and he's making this connection between the local dynamics here and in Colombia. Yanis, let me see.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Hey, Yanis, great to hear your voice.
I'm not sure whether my picture is on or not, but I can't find my camera here.
Not yet, but please go ahead with your voice.
Okay. Look, I think
we lost Yanis. It seems that not only picture but also voice.
No. I just registered as a panelist, and I'm now allowed to be seen by others. So you asked me initially question how Geneva looks from Strasbourg, and I can tell you a distant place of 400 kilometers away. So that's as much as I can say, because there's very little interaction, or at least echo of Geneva work in Strasbourg is very limited. Nevertheless, Strasbourg itself is reasonably vibrant place for different activities related to digital, starting with the Cybercrime Convention and the second protocol on international cooperation in digital evidence, which has been just finalized on 28th of May and will be open for signature sometime middle next year, and the Budapest Convention itself will celebrate its 20 years of existence in November this year. So as a result, there is a little bit of kind of jealousy for the process which has been now launched in New York and Vienna on the UN Cybercrime Convention, and obviously we need to look about intentions of different players in launching that process, and one can already envisage that there will be a bit of a clash between those member states who are part of Budapest Convention and those who want to modify certain aspects of Budapest Convention. The second element that I would like to mention is the ongoing work in the Council of Europe in preparation for the negotiations of a legally binding instrument on artificial intelligence and human rights. That the expert process should end in December by publishing elements of possible future agreement. And then next year we'll begin the intergovernmental negotiation process, which technically should end within next 2 years. We'll see how far we will be able to reach agreement, and then whether the legal instrument will be strong and wide or narrow and weak. So that the time will show. But I also would like to comment what was said during the conversation on internet governance. Richard said that turbulent times and so on. Look, it depends what you mean by term internet governance. It was coined in early 2000s, and at that time it was predominantly focused on governance of critical resources, infrastructure, and overall, let's say, governance of domain name system. Increasingly, we're not talking any longer about infrastructure. We're still talking a little bit about access. That was also a topic at that time. But we're talking about actual use of internet, and if the use of internet falls under internet governance conversation, then of course it's endless. I would rather see that we're phasing out the conversation about internet governance as such as a term, and understanding that everything we're talking about includes a digital or is digital by default, and that would bring us to a decentralized way of addressing digital issues related to actual use of internet. So again, maybe that sounds a little bit theoretical, but I hardly see that we can keep the centralized conversation about actual use of digital applications in real life. So,
thank you, Yanis, for a great. We are a bit worried that Geneva is not seen from Strasbourg, although the distance is only 400 kilometers. But it probably reflects what is happening in this city and many cities worldwide, that we are getting increasingly fragmented within our silos, organizations, and systems. How to overcome this? This is a huge, huge challenge within the Geneva, but also between Geneva and Strasbourg, Geneva and Brussels. We are discussing this issue, Geneva and Paris, New York and other, Beijing, New Delhi and other places. This is a huge, huge challenge. But what in particular I like in your statement is this point that basically digital is becoming so mainstream that it will sooner or later disappear as a qualifier. It will, e-commerce will be just e-commerce, digital health will be just health, online human rights will be just human rights with strong digital component, but it will be mainstream. Probably this is conceptually good way to approach it. Thank you, Yanis. And we will go now quickly to Richard to comment and then to Anya to see what is currently in stake when it comes to practical negotiation, the future of IGF. Richard, over to you.
Yeah, I completely agree with Yanis. I mean, these issues are complex, and we won't find global agreements, so they need to be handled really at a local level. But that's difficult because of the nature of the beast. For example, you cannot have a local content policy because Facebook has its own content policy, and so Facebook decides what is or is not published to the users, the citizens in your country. So that's an issue. We have dominant global corporations, and so it's difficult to apply local standards, even respecting human rights. And then, of course, you have the added problem that not everybody agrees on how to implement human rights. And the answer to your question, Jovan, what is the solution? Well, you know the solution. States should agree to cooperate, and it doesn't matter if it's in Geneva or Strasbourg or Brussels, as long as they agree to cooperate. But unfortunately, we're not seeing much agreement to cooperate. There's some, good signs like in security, cybersecurity, as Roxana and you mentioned, but in other areas, there's a lot of divergence. And so what it really would require is states to move to a more cooperative mode. And unfortunately, I have to say this, that would require the US to abandon its hegemonic aspirations, which it shows no sign of doing. You thought Trump is bad, well, Biden is no better. The US is still wanting to act as a hegemon without really assuming responsibility for it. And that, of course, makes the other states less willing to cooperate. So I don't know how to solve that.
Richard, there are some niches. You mentioned that there is a dialogue between Russia and the United States on cybersecurity after the Geneva summit. There is in field of standardization. In 2 hours, I will address G20 meeting on standardization, and there are some moves in this direction. Now, Anya, you have been hearing from Roxana, from Richard, from Yanis, how complex is the setup. In a way, IGF is the only place which structurally should somehow bring all these threads together in a very unique setup of multi-stakeholder, multilateral. IGF is a result of so many compromises, and it's probably the reason why it survived, why it had vitality, but it is also the reason for some sort of confusion in the organization and running of the IGF. Do we have some hope that IGF may be prepared for this potential new role that it may help? What is going on? You told us about cooking in the environmental field. What is going on in the kitchen on the IGF future?
Oh, yes, thank you very much. A very good question. I think when you talk about the IGF, and obviously the metrics for its relevance to the global community, then probably there are qualifiers you should introduce. One relates just merely to numbers, and another one relates to the issues that are discussed. The numbers is a very broad concept when it comes about the IGF. It relates to the number of people who are actually involved in its processes. And I don't mean just merely on the number of people coming to its annual meeting, but I mean on the number of people involved in the processes throughout the year. We also speak about the number of people that are coming to what you mentioned at the beginning, national, regional, and youth IGFs as IGF concepts, which are independent of the IGF, but very closely tied to it, that exist on levels of countries and regions. And I think in that sense, we are seeing a very bright future of the IGF as a concept. Just because the number of participants is growing, primarily the number of different member states is growing, the number of different disciplines the nature, the diversity among them is growing at the IGF. Some of you may recall the call of the Secretary General that was given at the opening of the 2018 IGF in Paris. And that call included a couple of action points. One of the action points was to include the weak and missing voices. And in that sense, referring to disciplines which are completely unrepresented or underrepresented at the IGF. So environment being one of those, but we also need to speak, for example, about the agriculture, which is not that much at the priority of the IGF's agenda, or at least it wasn't in past, and is most certainly something that has a global relevance, and digitalization processes are entering strongly on that field. Philosophers, anthropologists, banking sector, private sector overall that needs to be represented, the SMEs and so on. And so the IGF has been very much focused on, first of all, attracting those missing voices, ensuring that the organized multi-stakeholder efforts exist on local levels, so in various countries. So for instance, for years, you couldn't see small Pacific island developing states at the IGF. Now you can see them. We're expanding also in terms of the national IGFs present on various continents. So for example, in Africa, we've seen a growth of over 30% in the past 4 years. We've seen also the GRULAC region very much well covered, and the quality of those processes are growing. So as I said at the beginning, that's I think the most important qualifier here, that the forum that's been, as you said, a result of a compromise, or better yet, a forum that was called by people to work for people, is still relevant for people just because it has a growing participation and it has application at the local levels of its model, meaning a multi-stakeholder, bottom, inclusive and open process to discuss internet governance. So that's something that we see as positive. Obviously, the process is continuously evolving and improving. The roadmap for digital cooperation is one of the most recent documents, which very clearly calls for advancing of the process in a couple of areas, such as making stronger its intersessional work, forging linkages with the local levels through the NRIs, attracting legislators, ministers, or the decision makers in terms of the governments. And you'll see that the upcoming 16th IGF, for example, responds to those calls, which I think also predate the roadmap, just because through the taking stock calls of the IGF, the community has been really advising that needs to be improved. So for instance, the dedicated parliamentary track at the 16th IGF will be speaking about different legal approaches to internet governance overall, and we're expecting a number of members of parliaments to meet with other stakeholder groups and to discuss how can we make the internet safer, more secure, affordable and accessible place for all. The high-level leaders track as well is very much improved. It's going to include leaders and experts of different disciplines from different backgrounds to speak about the hot topics currently of the IGF and how can we all cooperate together to ensure that we bring solutions to the issues that we identified as relevant. So all in all, I think that the IGF by 2025, when formally it will go again to be a subject for discussion on its future with the General Assembly, does have a bright future and does definitely have a concrete metrics to offer in terms of its relevance and credibility globally. There's much to be done. I think as digital technologies are making more and more integration in people's lives and they're changing basically every day, the IGF is trying its best to follow that pace along with its multi-stakeholder advisory group, and it will definitely continue to do so. Finally, to close, I'll just tell you that right now, this is probably the busiest time of the year for the IGF Secretariat and all other parties involved. We are working with the Polish government to host the 16th annual IGF meeting soon in December in Katowice. But at the same time, we already work on 2022 processes. We'll be soon going to Addis Ababa. As you know, the Ethiopian government will be hosting the next year's IGF, and a number of innovations will be placed in Ethiopia in terms of the structure, while the content is always dictated by the momentum and it's dictated by the people through a bottom-up call. This year, the COVID-19 to a certain extent dominates the narratives and will definitely be included in the discussions on the 6 issue areas that we'll be focusing on. And for the next year, let's hope the COVID-19 pandemic will be just involved in the discussions in terms of lessons learned, but not the present threat as it is this year.
Thank you. Thank you, Anya. It is really a rich meal. It's not as completely baked as environment for serving, but I can see that you're working very hard. You miss a few spices here and there, which we may add, but thank you for this presenting this really rich offer. One of the spices probably from the great comments from Mark Carville. Mark, great to ECU. He argues that IGF can help overcoming policy silos and fragmentation policymakers. And then in his last line, he mentioned the aims of Global Digital Compact. This is definitely one spice that we should discuss, or probably not now, but maybe Roxana, Richard, and others can reflect. As you know, Global Digital Compact is proposed by UN Secretary General in his Our Common Agenda. By the way, one very interesting policy document. It was in the same paragraph or same section with the IGF, but there was somehow ambiguous linkage with the IGF. Should IGF work on it? Should it be a separate process? And now we don't have a time for that, but this is one issue where there will be a need to dive deeper. Who will, for example, work on the Global Digital Compact, which should be ready by 2023, quite ambitious for the future summit in New York, September 2023. That's also a question. Another spicy question is the relation between IGF and all tech envoy aspect, but since time is running out, we'll ask now for the just concluding remark, what spice you would add, or what sort of compass tool or guiding tool you would advise us in Geneva to use to navigate this really rich scene here. First, Roxana, what is your advice? We have about 4 or 5 minutes, maybe 1 minute advice about navigating Geneva scene based on current all of this discussion.
Thank you, Jovan. Fascinating to follow what is happening at the IGF currently, and it's great to hear about all of these developments. When we look to the future, I think it's important to go back a bit to the fundamental values. So go back to some of the traditional areas that Geneva has been recognized for as well. For example, human rights, its capacity to convene all the relevant actors on international law, because we have many discussions, but we're missing rules that we can actually apply, and we're missing a clear understanding of the operationalization of these rules. And what we have currently in Geneva is a strong foundation, a strong basis for bringing these conversations down to a granular level and to actual guidance and commitments that become legal obligations. I think it's time to move ahead to a more regulated space where we have defined very clearly where we want to go, and that we embed these values into the rules that everybody can follow. Rather than having a confusing environment, we need to be very clear about what is a priority for our human development and act on creating those legal obligations that everybody can be bound to abide by. That would be my take on it.
Thank you. Therefore, clarity, reducing confusion, use what exists, and try to find concrete answers as soon as possible because time is pressing. Thank you for this advice. Richard, what would be your suggestion about the next steps in Geneva?
Yeah, I agree with what Roxana said, and I would say that I think the way to do that, as I said before, states should recognize that we need more cooperation, not less. And so they should really work together in good faith. And I've seen a fair amount of bad faith in the sense that they take one position in one forum, a completely opposite position in another forum. And the other thing, I think there's not yet enough coordination within states in many areas. For example, there's some e-signature proposals submitted in WTO, which, and I know quite a bit about e-signatures. I was involved in the beginning when that came up. I think those proposals actually don't make sense, and they have not been consulted with the relevant parts of national governments. Because, as you know, trade negotiators are kind of siloed, and they often are very secretive, and you don't have access to what they're doing. So I think there's a need for more coordination at the national level, and then more cooperation at the international level. And then we could realize what Roxana mentioned, which I fully agree with.
Coordination, cooperation, reducing confusion again. This is echoing as a point. Maybe, Yanis, if you're still online, just a short tweet style advice from you, and then Vidania will conclude, and we will wrap up the session. Yanis, okay, we go to Anya. Anya, what would be your advice?
So my advice is that the internet, just as a medium, is so complex, and its issues are so different at local levels, that the only meaningful way to approach and tackle the issues is to firstly understand what are the local specificities, come together in a multi-stakeholder manner, and try to resolve those. So the International Geneva can play an important role there by, first of all, strengthening connections with the multi-stakeholder local levels, and then bringing them together in the framework of its International Geneva setup, and ensure that we are all part of the solution process for resolving the issues.
Great. Anya, bringing a bit of Swiss aspect of a subsidiarity principle of addressing issues the closest to affected people and possible solution, which is sometimes missing in digital discussion. We always think the internet is global, and it is global, and Richard mentioned Facebook example, but there are some other possibilities where a local solution could be the way to build up the global solution, and hopefully put everything together in Geneva. We haven't heard from Yanis on this point. Definitely message for Yanis is to act as ambassador of Geneva in Strasbourg, and we as the ambassador of Strasbourg in Geneva, because those linkages, boundary spanners, people who understand different policy frameworks, who understand technological and policy and diplomatic aspects, I think they're precious. I'm teaching in College of Europe, and what I'm advising my students is to prepare to be boundary spanners. That would be one of the major skills. And I can see among our participants, many current or potential boundary spanners. Let's continue our journey through International Geneva by focusing particularly on that. What's going on beyond the wall of the organization, within the same mission, between different offices, back in the capital, between one ministry. Richard mentioned digital signature problem. And we are encountering more and more confusing and sometimes even tragicomic developments, where one hand doesn't know, right hand doesn't know what left hand is doing on the national, regional, and global level. And with this, I would conclude on a bit of more optimistic note. There are different interests, there are different positions, but and they will be always there. But what we can do as international community is to reduce confusion on local, national, regional, and global level, and then leave different interests to be negotiated. They will be always around. This is what is diplomacy for, and what Geneva has been serving for almost 2 centuries. Reduce confusion. What was the keywords? Cooperate on the global level, coordinate on the local level, and increase the role of those boundary spanners. And thank you for all of you being a boundary spanners, great contributors. In particular, special thanks go to Anya, Richard, Roxana, and Yanis. We continue our journey on internet governance, but also on other policy issues. Next week, we are walking cybersecurity tour, and it will be an interesting tour. Roxana already hinted a few pointers, and that would be exciting update on what's going on in Geneva on cybersecurity, cybercrime, and other related issues. Have a nice day, and see you in November. All the best. Bye.